In a previous video, we looked at the installation of the GoE controller, as well as the initial setup and operation via the controller's display. However, you can carry out the setup not only on the display, but also remotely in the GoE app. For some users, that might be even easier. In addition, for certain functions such as controlling PV surplus charging or dynamic load management, integrating the device into the GoE app is absolutely essential. In this video, I'll show you how to carry out the setup for the GoE controller in the app and which settings you can configure. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so that you'll always receive the latest updates. Open the GoE app. If you've already set up a GoE charger, you'll need to return to the device overview to add a new device. When the GoE controller is set up, you'll also find it here. Since in our case the GoE controller hasn't been set up yet, we'll click here and this screen will appear. If you haven't set up either a GoE charger or a GoE controller yet, you'd see this screen automatically. All right, now let's add the GoE controller. Now, scan the QR code that you'll find on the supplied data card to automatically connect to the GoE controller's Wi-Fi hotspot. The device is now being connected. To establish the connection, make sure you're near the GoE controller. Once the GoE controller is connected to the hotspot, you'll land on the setup screen at step number 2. To complete the initial setup of the controller, follow the same steps you already know from setting up your GoE charger. As soon as the initial setup of the controller is complete, you can make further settings in the app. To do so, go straight to your controller's start screen. By the way, if you've completed the full setup, including the internet connection, and want to add your GoE controller to the app on another smartphone, it's just as easy as with the charger. Open the GoE app on the other smartphone and click this button here to add the GoE controller. Then enter the serial number you'll find on the data card. Next, type in the password, either the default password printed on the data card or the one that you created during the initial setup. Confirm the terms of use and the controller will be added to the app right away. All right, let's take a look at the settings in the app. On the Start screen under the Controller tab, you can see the current power of each category. Categories Grid, Solar, Battery, and Home are displayed here by default. Of course, the corresponding values only appear if the setup for them has been carried out. More on that a bit later. If you've already set up a GoE charger or other categories, you'll see them listed below. If you tap one of the categories, for example, Grid, only the categories connected to it will be displayed. In other words, those drawing power from the grid. Under this navigation item here, you'll find a detailed overview of each category and sensor. You'll also see charts showing your energy flows over the past few hours. It's also possible to export all the data from the GoE controller. When you go to the settings menu, you can, just as on the controller's display itself, configure sensors, create and adjust categories, perform time and display settings, change the password, or give your GoE controller a custom name. Note, however, that these settings in the app are only required if you haven't already performed the setup via the controller's display, or if you'd like to change specific settings later in the GoE app. If you now select Sensors in Settings, you can configure the voltage and current sensors and read voltage, current, and power values in real time for each of them. By the way, you can also do this directly on the GoE controller. For the current sensors, internal 1 to internal 6, current and power are always measured. And for the voltage sensors, L1 to L3, the voltage of the connected phases are measured. For the power calculation by the GoE controller to be truly accurate, and for functions such as PV surplus charging and dynamic load management to work correctly, you must ensure that you've set the correct voltage reference for all phases, and that the correct categories and power factors are assigned. You can find detailed information on what to consider in our video about installing the GoE controller. In this video, I'll just explain where you can find each setting in the app. If you select one of the voltage sensors, for example, voltage sensor L1, you'll see all measurement values for the selected phase. If you've accidentally connected one or more supply phases in the wrong order, you can also change the voltage phase assignment here by changing the assigned phase, for example, from L1 to L2. If you select one of the current sensors in the sensor overview, such as internal 1, you'll be taken to the data overview for that sensor. If you've installed a current transformer the wrong way around, meaning not with the arrow in the direction of the current flow, you can invert the sensor here using the toggle switch. Keep in mind that power should always be positive when drawing electricity from the grid. For a solar inverter or an AC battery, the power should be positive when feeding energy into the grid. However, if the battery is charging or the inverter has a higher standby consumption than it produces, the power may be negative. If no current is being consumed, the power should be approximately 0. If you want to change the phase assignment, you can do so here. If you want to adjust, add, or delete an assigned load category, click on Categories to make your changes. In the submenu Categories, you can decide which category the selected load, in our case internal 1, should be assigned to. To do this, simply enter a numerical value in the respective category for the factor by which this electrical load should be taken into account. For example, if you're using a sensor to measure your grid connection, you should assign this load to a grid category with a factor of 1. If you don't have a separate sensor on the load branch, meaning for your remaining household, you should also assign the home category with a factor of 1. If you're measuring the current of a 3-phase AC PV system using only one sensor on a single phase, you must set the sensor for the solar category of that sensor to 3, so that the total output of the PV system is displayed correctly. This works because a 3-phase inverter delivers the same power on all phases. That way, you can save 2 sensor connections for other purposes. If you click on Categories in the Settings menu, you'll reach this page. Here you can select individual categories and then assign them to various connected sensors. This is an alternative way to link loads and sensors with each other. In addition to the fixed categories, you can also create custom categories. For example, for an air conditioning unit if you're measuring it via a sensor. If you select one of the default categories, such as Home, you can directly enter a number behind the name of the corresponding current sensor, for instance, Internal, to define the factor by which that category should be considered by that sensor. If you've already entered factors via the GoE controller display or through the sensor configuration section of the app, these numbers will already appear here. For user-defined categories, you can add new ones or change the name of an existing custom category. For example, renaming it to boiler if that's what you're measuring with a sensor. Now, let's take a look at some further general settings. Here, you can rename your GoE controller, adjust date and time settings, make changes to the controller's display, or restart the controller. Advanced users can, for instance, synchronize the time via the app. If the GoE controller is connected to the internet through the GoE cloud, it automatically receives the current time from there, so no manual setting is required in that case. Within the time settings, you can define the time zone and activate automatic daylight savings adjustments. If you want to make display adjustments for the GoE controller, go to Display Settings under Settings. Here you can, for example, change the language, rotate the display, adjust its brightness, and much more. If you select Connection under Settings, you can configure all network connection settings. Besides Wi-Fi, hotspot, or Ethernet or LAN, additional connections for experts and integrators can be defined. The status of all network connections is shown via the information icon next to the network, and can also be adjusted. Under the About section, you can view information about the hardware. There you'll also find the serial number, and you can download the current firmware. All right, now let's take a look at the settings for PV surplus charging and load management. To do so, switch in the app from the GoE controller to the GoE charger by returning to the GoE controller start page and tapping up here. This brings you back to the selection page with a list of available devices. Now select the GoE charger for which you'd like to configure PV surplus charging or load management settings. After switching from your GoE controller to your GoE charger, you'll land on its start screen in the charger view. Go to Settings. If you want to check your connection or if your GoE charger isn't yet linked to your GoE controller, go into the General Settings and click Controller. Any installed GoE controllers can be automatically integrated into the GoE app if you've activated the option. Normally, GoE controllers are found automatically. Only if the controller has just been installed or if you've disabled automatic scanning, you'll need to tap Scan Now. A charger can only be connected to one controller at a time, but one controller can be connected to any number of chargers simultaneously. Now that we've ensured our GoE controller is connected, let's configure the settings for PV surplus charging. Go to the Eco tab and select PV surplus. Now, activate the toggle Charge with PV surplus, and then configure the detailed settings for solar charging. Here you can set up the start level that your PV system must reach before the GoE charger begins charging your EV. This value must be at least 1.4 kilowatts. Once you've defined the start level, select whether, during surplus charging, you prefer to draw a small amount of electricity from the grid, feed some into it, or choose to balance a mix of both. This setting is important because your electric car can only charge at specific power levels, and sometimes you need to draw a little extra power from the grid to reach the next level. If you'd rather avoid using grid electricity, some power will instead be fed into the grid. When charging single phase, each power level corresponds to 230 watts, which in extreme cases could almost entirely be either fed into or drawn from the grid, depending on your settings. Selecting Prefer Grid Power means that if your PV system doesn't quite produce enough power to reach the next charging level or threshold, a small amount of grid power will be used to reach it. This allows you to consume all of your solar energy yourself, though you'll still see a minimal amount of grid import on your meter. Choosing Standard gives you a mixed mode. Your meter will alternatively move slightly forwards and backwards during charging. Selecting Feed into the grid means that as long as your PV system surplus isn't enough to reach the next charging level, a small amount of excess energy will be fed into the grid. You can also define a grid target value that influences the surplus regulation. For instance, if you enter -200, the surplus charging will be controlled so that approximately 200 watts are continuously fed into the grid. This is especially useful with battery storage systems that aren't measured, for example DC coupled ones, as it prevents constant discharge of the battery. Then choose whether you want to charge single phase or 3-phase, or let the GoE controller decide automatically and switch phases depending on the available power. The power level for 3-phase switching defines what surplus output your PV system must reach before the Wallbox switches from single to 3-phase charging and vice versa. Typically, 4.2 kilowatts is recommended. That's the minimum charging power at 6 amps, 3-phase. Phase switching can make PV surplus charging significantly more efficient, since during single-phase charging, even small energy surpluses can already be used for charging. By the way, 3-phase charging is only possible if your GoE charger is connected 3-phase and your car supports 3-phase charging. If you want to make sure your GoE charger charges your EV by morning with a specific amount of energy, and you'd like to use PV energy or cheap electricity from a supplier with flexible tariffs, then you should set up a charging target. Go to the app settings. Here you can configure further settings for your charging sessions. Click here to make the adjustments. Set the time by which charging should be completed, as well as the desired amount of energy or range, and then tap this button to save your settings. You should also enable Eco Mode options here if you want to reach your charging target using PV surplus and/or flexible electricity tariffs whenever possible. Now return to the start screen and tap Eco. Your GoE charger will now start charging with PV surplus, provided of course that your PV system is producing electricity not already used by other devices in your home. By the way, if your electricity supplier with flexible tariffs is listed in the GoE app, you can activate it under the Eco tab in case you don't have enough PV power to charge your battery for the next day. However, this isn't required for PV surplus charging itself. And another thing, if your charging target hasn't been reached by sunset, you don't necessarily need to use a flexible electricity tariff when charging from the grid. Without a charging target, the GoE charger will only charge when PV surplus is available, so possibly not at all. With a target defined, the GoE charger will wait as long as possible for surplus power and charge with PV surplus when available. But at the same time, it ensures that the desired energy amount is reached, even if that means drawing electricity from the grid. If you want to use dynamic load management, tap Settings at the bottom of the app. Then go to Charging Settings and then Load Management. With your GoE controller, you can combine static and dynamic load management. Enter the value for dynamic load management in the field Maximum Grid Current. This is the maximum current in amperes that your house can draw from the grid. The GoE controller ensures that this limit is never exceeded while charging your EV together with the electricity consumption of your other household devices. If necessary, the GoE controller automatically reduces the charging power and later increases it again. That way, you can be sure that no power outage will occur. All other settings for load management are explained in a separate video about the GoE app, which we've linked for you here. I hope this video was helpful. If you've got any questions, just drop them in the comments below or visit our website. You'll find all of the links in the description. I'll see you in the next video, guys. Until then, I'm Amy from GoE.